Have you ever noticed that not everyone close to you was rooting for you? I am not talking about a declared enemy. I am talking about something more subtle, harder to name, and for that very reason, more dangerous. The person who followed your every advancement with a smile that never reached their eyes. Who asked questions about your life with a frequency that seemed like interest, but in the silence left a weight that had no immediate explanation. Who drew near in your moments of need, but strategically disappeared in moments of celebration. You felt it. Perhaps you didn't know how to name it. But you felt that specific strangeness of being in the presence of someone who occupies the space of friendship without carrying its content. And the question that remained, the one you perhaps didn't even ask out loud for fear of appearing paranoid, is this: was I being protected without knowing it? Was there something working around me that was not visible to me, but was operating anyway? The answer this video will give you is yes. And the demonstration of this will pass through the Bible, through science, and through the most precise logic that exists regarding how integrity functions as a field of protection. Because what you will understand today will change not only the way you read the past, it will change the way you walk forward. Stay with me until the end. There is a phenomenon that researchers at USP, who study group dynamics and social capital in Brazilian communities, have documented, and it has a name that will resonate with what you have experienced. The phenomenon is called asymmetric monitoring of assent, the observed tendency in close social groups that, when an individual begins to show signs of growth, certain members of the group increase the volume of attention they dedicate to that individual, not with the goal of supporting the growth, but of monitoring the vulnerabilities that the process of growth inevitably exposes. The research identified that this monitoring is rarely conscious and rarely declared. It disguises itself as interest, concern, or proximity. And the person being monitored often only recognizes what was happening retrospectively, after the dynamics have changed. This has an older name, which appears repeatedly in the scriptures, and which most people associate only with stories of the past, without realizing it is a present and measurable pattern. The name is envy, not as an occasional and harmless emotion, as a systemic force that organizes behavior. And understanding the mechanics of envy is fundamental for you to comprehend what was operating around you and what was protecting you without you knowing it. In Hebrew, the word the biblical text uses most frequently in the context of envy and veiled opposition is tsara, T-S-A-R-A-R. The root of the term carries the image of narrowing, compressing, reducing the space available for someone. Tsara is the act of pushing someone's limits inward, of trying to compress the space of expansion that the other occupies. It is exactly what you felt, not a frontal and declared attack, a constant lateral pressure intended to narrow what you believed was possible for you, a series of micro-impacts, each apparently insignificant, but which together had the effect of reducing the internal volume of your expectation. And here is the data that will change the way you understand what happened. Tsara, as real as it may be, only works if it finds internal resonance. It only narrows those who are already inclined to narrow themselves. It only compresses those who are willing to yield the space. And you did not yield, not because you were perfect, not because you didn't feel the pressure, but because there was something operating in you that could not be compressed, because your source of identity and value was not in the place where the tsara strikes. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, because the next content will continue building exactly on what we are establishing here, and you will need the full vocabulary to operate with authority at the level the new season demands. Don't miss it. I want to take you now into one of the most precise biblical stories about what happens when someone with divine authority is surrounded by veiled opposition from those who should be by their side. His name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to the Persian king Artaxerxes. He held a position of trust, access, and proximity to power. And when he received the news that the walls of Jerusalem were in ruins and his people in dishonor, he asked the king for permission to go and rebuild. He arrived in Jerusalem. He evaluated the walls in silence at night, without revealing his purpose to anyone before having complete clarity on the project. And then he summoned the people for the work. And it was exactly at that moment that the opposition appeared. Sanballat the Horonite, Tobiah the Ammonite, Geshem the Arab, The text presents them by name, by origin, by position. They were in places of regional influence and had a direct interest in Jerusalem remaining in ruins, because walls erected in Jerusalem represented an authority they did not control. And the tactics they used are a precise map of what you lived through. First came the mockery. Sanballat said before the army of Samaria, "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore stones from the heaps of rubbish?" Tobiah added, "If a fox goes up on the stone wall they are building, he will break it down." It was ridicule as a strategy of discouragement, to make the project small, to make the builder smaller. When mockery did not work, threats of military action came. And when threats did not stop the work, invitations came. Sanballat and Geshem sent a message to Nehemiah 5 times, inviting him to a meeting in a neutral place in the villages of the plain of Ono. And what Nehemiah replied on all 5 occasions was identical. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" 5 invitations, 5 identical answers, the same clarity 5 times in a row. Observe what the invitation represented. It was a withdrawal from the field of operation, leaving the place of authority, the context of purpose, for a neutral space where the agenda belonged to the opponent. And Nehemiah did not go once. But the last strategy was the most sophisticated. Sanballat sent an open letter, intended to be read publicly, saying there were rumors that Nehemiah was rebuilding the walls to proclaim himself king, and that this would reach the knowledge of Artaxerxes. It was a threat of narrative, an attempt to destroy his reputation before the project was complete. And Nehemiah's response, recorded in chapter 6, is one of the most precise moments in the entire Bible about how someone who is shielded operates. "No such things as you say are being done. You are inventing them out of your own heart." No such things as you say. No elaborate defense. No attempt to manage the public narrative. No meeting to resolve the misunderstanding. 1 sentence and an immediate return to work. And the walls were finished in 52 days. Chapter 6, verse 16, records the response of the opponents with a precision that is impossible not to recognize. "When all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God." They were not punished supernaturally. They were reduced by the evidence of what God was doing through Nehemiah. The completed work was the most powerful response that any strategy of retribution could have been. And here is the principle that will reorganize everything you understood about what you lived. The best response to veiled opposition is not the confrontation of the opposition. It is the completion of the work. Your prospering is the answer. Your advancing is the answer. Your remaining whole is the answer. Nehemiah did not destroy Sanballat. Nehemiah finished the walls, and it was the completion of the walls that reduced Sanballat. Like this video now, because the principle of Nehemiah needs to reach those who are being summoned to the meeting in Ono right now, those who are being called to abandon the work to argue with those who do not want the work to be completed. Like it and make this message reach where it needs to go. Now I need to give you a Greek word that will precisely name the field of protection that operated around you while you did not know it. The word is skepe, S-K-E-P-E. Skepe is the term used in biblical Greek for covering, shelter, shadow protection. It is the image of the shield that is not carried by the protected one, but extended over them by a superior authority. The shadow that protects is not generated by the person under it. It is generated by the source that creates it. Psalm 91, which in Hebrew uses the word tzil, shadow, for the same idea, describes a field of protection that operates independently of the awareness of the protected. "He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress. My God, in Him I will trust. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence." The snare of the fowler. The image of Psalm 91 is not of a frontal attack, it is of a trap, of something prepared with care to capture, without the prey realizing it is being captured. And what the psalm promises is that the skepeos, the covering, the shadow of protection, operates over the snare before the protected one perceives the snare. The trap prepared for you did not reach you because it encountered the covering first. But there is a condition that Psalm 91 presents that is fundamental to understand precisely, so as not to turn it into a magic formula. Verse 1 says, "He who dwells." The verb is one of permanence, of residence. Not he who occasionally visits the secret place, but he who makes the secret place his dwelling. The field of protection that operated over you was not generated by an emergency prayer made in a moment of crisis. It was the accumulated result of a life of alignment with the presence of God. It was the skepe built in the secret place, in the time of worship when no one was looking, in the faithfulness maintained when there was no audience. And this has a scientific correlate that will surprise you. Researchers from the Institute of Psychology at PUCSP conducted a study on what they called structural resilience in adults who had gone through periods of intense interpersonal opposition characterized by proximity betrayal, veiled sabotage, and deliberate social isolation. What they wanted to understand was what differentiated the individuals who emerged from these processes whole from those who emerged fragmented. The differentiating factor was not the intensity of the opposition received. It was what the researchers called deep identity anchoring, the degree to which the individual's identity was anchored in sources that were not accessible to the opposition. Identity anchored in internal values, in spiritual conviction, in purpose that preceded any external approval, proved consistently resistant to tsara, to the pressure of narrowing, in a way that identity anchored in social recognition simply did not demonstrate. In simple terms, the more deeply your sense of who you are was anchored in something that no person around you could take away, the less space the opposition found to operate. The skepe is not just supernatural protection. It is the natural consequence of an identity that does not depend on human approval to remain whole. And you built that, perhaps without having the language for what you were building, but you built it. Go to the comments now and write the word shielded, S-H-I-E-L-D-E-D, because shielded does not mean invulnerable in the sense of not feeling. It means that what was sent to reduce you did not find the anchoring point it would need to work. It means your identity was anchored too deep to be moved by surface pressure, shielded. But now I need to show you something about the principle that the Bible describes as the pit turning back, because this principle is often misinterpreted, and I need you to understand it correctly, both for your spiritual integrity and your emotional health. Psalm 7 contains a description of the pattern of justice that operates when someone prepares a trap for the innocent. Verses 15 and 16 say, "He made a pit and digged it, and is fallen into the ditch which he made. His mischief shall return upon his own head, and his violent dealing shall come down upon his own pate." This pattern also appears in the story of Haman, in Esther, who built a gallows of 50 cubits to hang Mordecai, and was hanged on the same gallows, and in the story of Joseph, whose brothers sold him into slavery, and found in that same Joseph the only source of food during the famine. But observe carefully what these texts describe. They do not describe God punishing opponents as an act of retribution favorable to the protected. They describe a moral law of sowing and reaping that operates at the level of character. What someone architectures against the innocent often turns back, because the logic of the trap itself is self-destructive. Haman was not punished because Esther asked for his punishment. He was exposed because the logic of his own scheme exposed him before the king. Joseph's brothers were not punished by Joseph. They were confronted by the natural consequence of a famine they did not control, which led them to the only place where there was provision, which was exactly where the brother they had tried to destroy was positioned in authority. The principle of the pit is not a tool of retribution that the believer activates against their opponents. It is a law of justice that operates independently of the participation of the protected, and the correct posture before it is not celebration. It is the sobriety of one who recognizes that actions have consequences and that this applies to everyone, including oneself. Joseph, upon revealing his identity to the brothers who had sold him, did not say, "You are finally getting what you deserve." He said, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Joseph's interpretation was not of vengeance fulfilled, it was of providence recognized. And that is the posture that will serve you in the long run. Not the celebration of what happened to those who opposed you, but the recognition that the same providence that protected you was operating over the entire picture, including over the consequences that the opposition generated for itself. This is not naivety, it is spiritual maturity. And this maturity is what will protect your calling from being contaminated by the bitterness that often accompanies those who have survived proximity betrayal. UFMG published research on emotional health in survivors of interpersonal betrayal that identified two distinct patterns of processing. The first group, which researchers called processing of victory over the opponent, organized the narrative of the experience around the decline of those who had betrayed them. The second group, called post-adversity growth processing, organized the narrative around what the experience had revealed about their own capacity. The follow-up data 3 years later were unequivocal. The first group presented significantly worse indicators of mental health and satisfaction with their own trajectory. The second group demonstrated not only greater subjective well-being, but higher objective performance in professional and relational goals. The reason is neurological as well as spiritual. Keeping attention on the opponent's decline maintains the activation of the threat system in the brain, even when the threat no longer exists. The nervous system does not distinguish between monitoring the opponent out of fear and monitoring out of satisfaction. In both cases, the opponent remains at the center of the field of attention, and where attention goes, energy follows. Joseph was not monitoring his brothers in the years he governed Egypt. He was governing Egypt. And when the brothers appeared, it was not because Joseph was looking for them, it was because providence led them to the place where he was. The best protection against the residual effects of opposition is not vigilance over opponents. It is consistent advancement in purpose. Now I need to tell you about the second Hebrew word for today, which will name the spiritual state that functioned as a field of protection around you, and that you need to maintain consciously now that you have the vocabulary for it. The word is shamar, S-H-A-M-A-R. Shamar is the verb for guarding, careful vigilance, active protection. It is the word used when God places Adam in the garden to dress it and to keep it. Shamar, the garden. It is the word of Psalm 121, which says, "He who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper, the Lord is your shade at your right hand." But Shamar is not just the protection God extends over you. It is also the guard you exercise over what has been entrusted to you. And in the context of what you have just crossed, Shamar has an immediate practical application. You survived a season of veiled opposition with your integrity intact, with your identity anchored, with the work advancing despite the pressure. This is not small. This is the result of years of construction in the secret place, of alignment with the presence of God in moments where no audience was watching. And what you need to shamar now, what you need to guard with active vigilance, is exactly that. The state of anchoring that shielded you, the quality of presence in the secret place that generated the skepe, the alignment with the identity that God says you are, that did not yield to the tsarar. Because the temptation that comes after surviving a season of opposition is to relax the guard, to assume that because the difficult period has passed, the level of spiritual vigilance that produced the protection can also decrease. But Shamar is continuous. The keeper of Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. It is not temporary. It is not intensified only in crisis. Researchers from Datafolha on practices of spirituality and well-being in Brazilian adults over 40 identified a pattern that confirms this principle. Individuals who maintained consistent spiritual practices throughout calm periods, and not just in periods of crisis, presented significantly greater capacity to maintain identity integrity when periods of interpersonal pressure arrived. The correlation was direct. The depth of protection in moments of crisis was directly related to the consistency of practice in moments of non-crisis. The secret place that built the field of protection does not maintain itself. It is cultivated, shamar. And the level of protection available in the next period of pressure depends on the depth of cultivation in the period of peace you are entering now. Share this video with someone who is in the midst of a season of veiled opposition right now, who is feeling the pressure of tsarar without having the vocabulary for what they are feeling, who is confusing the pressure with evidence that something went wrong, when in fact it is evidence that something very right is happening with that person. Share it. Be the channel of God's shamar, reaching those who need it. Now I am going to give you 3 practical movements to consolidate what you understood today and transform it into daily operation. The first movement is the anchoring inventory. The protection that operated over you was anchored in something. You need to know what it is with precision, not in a generic way, so you can cultivate it deliberately. Ask this question. When the pressure hit hardest, what kept the sense of identity intact? Not the correct theological answer, the honest answer about what concretely kept you anchored. Was it your morning prayer practices? Was it a specific group of people with whom you shared real vulnerability? Was it a conviction about your calling that remained clear even when everything around was murky? Was it the systematic reading of a specific text? Identify it with precision. Because what is not identified cannot be cultivated deliberately, and what is not cultivated deliberately eventually becomes sporadic. The second movement is what I call clarity of response. Nehemiah developed a standard response for the invitations from Ono. I am doing a great work and I cannot come down. 5 invitations, 1 response. The consistency of the response was not rigidity, it was clarity about what was essential. You need to develop your Ono response, the clear and consistent response for situations that invite you to abandon the field of operation, to argue with those who do not want your work to be completed. Not as a memorized script, as an internal posture that knows how to distinguish what deserves a response from what deserves only a return to work. Because not every accusation needs a defense. Nehemiah understood this, and the people who are completing important works in your generation understand this too. The third movement is that of clean grief. Surviving proximity betrayal without processing the real loss it represents is not strength. It is postponement. And what is postponed eventually collects the price with interest. What you lost when you discovered that proximity was monitoring, not celebration, is real and needs to be mourned. Not indefinitely, not in a way that becomes a victim identity, but with enough honesty so that the wound is processed and not carried into new relationships as a distorted filter. The psychology of betrayal grief, according to UNIFSP research on the rupture of close bonds, shows that incomplete processing of interpersonal betrayal tends to install patterns of relational hypervigilance that paradoxically make the person more vulnerable to future cycles of veiled opposition, because hypervigilance consumes attention resources that would be used for genuine discernment and replaces them with generalized suspicion. Clean grief is not weakness. It is spiritual and emotional hygiene that protects the shamar of the new bonds that are arriving. You have come this far, and I need to tell you something with the clarity that this moment demands. What you went through did not make you small. It did not make you bitter. It did not make you distrustful of everyone and everything. Because you were shielded by something that the opposition had no way to access, not by perfect merit, but by real anchoring in the place where identity is defined by the one who created it, and not by the one who wants to compress it. There Tzara encountered the field of skepe. The veiled opposition encountered shamar, and the work they wanted to be abandoned continued, like the walls of Nehemiah, until its completion was the most eloquent response that any strategy of confrontation could have been. You do not need to celebrate what happened to those who opposed you. You need to recognize that the same providence that protected you was operating over the entire picture, and that your posture now is not one of triumph over the opponent, but of gratitude for the protection you sometimes did not know you were receiving. Go to the comments, write shielded, because shielded is what you were, and it is what you will continue to be. Not because no one else will try the tzara, but because the shama you will deliberately cultivate from now on will generate a depth of covering that makes the next period even safer than the last. Shielded. And the next video will show you how you operate with discernment at the relational level that the new season demands. How you recognize the second circle, the few who have real access to what is being built. How you open new proximities with the wisdom of one who survived monitoring, without developing the closure of one who trusts no one. How the sod, the intimate counsel, functions as a criterion of access for the next bonds that will enter your life. This content will be the relational map of the new season. Turn on the bell. Don't miss it. The field of protection is active. The work continues and you are shielded.